Ni hao, this is John Green from Taiwan History, and today we're going to be talking about... Whoa! Ah! That was good.
Stan, can we get a redo on that? ASAP? That's better. Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course US History, and today we're going to talk about not Taiwan. Well, you did have good popcorn chicken and shaved ice. Oh, and you didn't have a slavery problem to deal with. So today we're going to be talking about events concerning African Americans after the Civil War. Mr. Green, didn't African Americans already achieve their freedom after the Civil War? What more could they want? Only from the past. That was incredibly racist. No, we're going to talk about the era of Reconstruction all the way through the Civil Rights Movement. So specifically after the Civil War, many people were happy that America has finally reunited again, except for the South. The South had to deal with the loss of their slaves and the inevitable loss of their economy. The Southerners wanted to keep as many of their traditions as possible, so in an attempt to do so, they established the Black Codes. The Black Codes were a set of laws that replicate slavery by replacing restrictions on African Americans, such as forcing them to do work for low wages and crippling debt. The purpose of these Black Codes was to try to maintain white superiority. Oh, racists, why did you be so narcissistic? You know, all these Black Codes were kind of a flashback to when it came down to the slave codes. So after the end of the Civil War, most Southerners feared the loss of their economy with their workforce being completely liberated. In order to recuperate for their losses, they pushed for a system of sharecropping. This is when a landowner allows a resident to use the land in return for a share of the crops produced on the land. This basically meant that African Americans really had no way to be rich. And how could they become rich without having any actual rights? I mean, the South still treated them as property for crying out loud. So with Abraham Lincoln's 13th Amendment, slavery was supposed to be technically abolished, but as mentioned earlier, the South was having a tough time reacting to the new amendment and tried to push as many demoralizing attempts to recreate slavery. Congress had to pass the 14th Amendment in order to try to give the African Americans their legal rights and equal protection. However, that did not work because whites did not want to enforce it. The 15th Amendment also had to be passed because blacks were constantly being denied the right to vote. And how were they being denied the right to vote? Well, in order to vote, you needed to 1. Pay a poll tax, and 2. Pass a literacy test. And because most African Americans during that time were illiterate or had little to no money, it was pretty much, impossible for African Americans to vote. So pretty much after the loss of slavery, whites decided that they wanted to treat African Americans differently, and they did so by separating themselves from them. Yeah, I know, it's such a great idea for them to isolate the blacks, wasn't it? Stan, I was being sarcastic.
The Freedmen's Bureau was the first kind of primitive welfare agency used to provide food, clothing, medical care, and education to freedmen and to white refugees.
Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the name of the author? No shock. If I don't, shock. Let's see what we got here. In the metropolis of the modern world, in this, the closing of the 19th century, there has been assembled a congress of men and women of African blood to deliberate solemnly upon the present situation and an outlook of the darker races of mankind. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the question as to how far differences of race which show themselves, chiefly in the color of the skin and the texture of the hair, are going to be made hereafter the basis of denying to over half the world the right of sharing to their utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. Stan, I know this one. It is African-American artist Booker T. Washington. What? W.E.B. Du Bois? Address to the nation of the world? Man, I really don't feel like getting shocked today. Hey, Taiwanese John Green, get over here. Click it.
What?
Click it. So Du Bois' goal was to achieve solidarity between all peoples of African descent. Others, like Booker T. Washington, a former slave, promoted industrial education and economic opportunity, but not social equality for blacks. Washington stressed patience, manual training, and hard work for blacks, and also made the Atlantic Compromise speech, which outlined the philosophy that blacks should focus on economic gains, go to school, learn skills, and work their way up the ladder, and that Southern whites should help out to create an unresentful people. In an attempt to meet the demands of equality, Southern whites tried in many ways to segregate themselves from their former property, and in one way was seen in the Plessy versus Ferguson case.
So with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, the state of Louisiana enacted a law that required separate railway cars for blacks and whites after Homer Adolph Plessy took a seat in the whites-only car of Louisiana train and refused to move to the car reserved for the blacks and was arrested.
This particular case was important because it basically said that segregation was constitutional, leading to another exciting point in history, the Harlem Renaissance. So back home, many African Americans wanted to move from the South to the North and Northwest to avoid racial inequality. They also moved up north because of decreasing cotton prices, lack of industry workers, and the strengthening of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this migration led to higher wages, more educational opportunities, and better standards of life for some blacks. Pressing on, the Harlem Renaissance was interrupted by the start of World War I and had the recognition of the war cut short by the war's priority. As the people of the United States watched World War I ignite across Europe, African American citizens saw an opportunity to win the respect of their white neighbors. America was a segregated society, and African Americans were considered, at best, second-class citizens. But even as it became apparent that the United States would enter a war in Europe, blacks were still being turned away from military service. On the battlefield of World War I, many black troops were eager to fight, but most provided support services. Only a small percentage were actually involved in combat, yet the African American presence in France, helping in any capacity, often elicited overwhelming gratitude from the French. You see, the French can't fight, but they sure do know how to treat people. So after World War I, we can move on to more happier things like World War II. Stan, I don't know why I was laughing when I said that, because World War II is definitely not a funny topic. So African Americans played a significant role in World War II. More than 500,000 served in Europe. Despite the numbers, they still faced racial discrimination. Prior to the war, the military maintained a racially segregated force. In studies by the military, blacks were often classified as unfit for combat and were not allowed on the front lines. They were mostly given support duties and were not allowed in units with white soldiers. That changed, however, in 1941, when pressure from African American civil rights leaders convinced the government to set up all-black combat units as experiments. They were designed to see if African American soldiers could perform military tasks on the same level as white soldiers. Some of the units include the Tuskegee Airmen, who fought intense dogfights just like white men. So after World War II, we go into a time where America actually seemed to be doing something right for a change. The Civil Rights Movement. Many white Americans wanted to distance themselves from the blacks, still seeing them as inferior beings. They established the Jim Crow laws in order to limit their rights, even though it clearly goes against the Constitution. So the Jim Crow laws played a larger role than you might think, as it tried to limit the abilities of blacks and kept them from voting and segregated in public establishments, saying that a black person would not be able to use a white bathroom and was required by law to use the colored one. One way these laws were fought off was seen in the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education. In this case, people challenged the original Plessy v. Ferguson case and won, saying that the original ruling was unconstitutional and had it reversed. So good on you, American Judiciary Court of 1954. As for the rest of the civil rights movements, let's go to the thought bubble. So as the civil rights movement progressed, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. popped up in order to promote the nonviolent cause and spread of racial equality by promoting sit-ins with his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as well as his March on Washington, with his famous I Have a Dream speech, while others like Rosa Parks would sit in a bus helping with the new boycott movement. Unfortunately, King would be murdered at his peak, and the civil rights movement took a more violent approach to equality. A group called the Black Panthers, led by Bobby Seale, would promote violent forms of protest, and a man named Malcolm X would arrive, who would preach about black power and independence from the whites as the only true way to be equal. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So there are also a few acts that helped support the civil rights movement, and one of them was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act stated that public accommodations could not be segregated and that nobody could be denied access to public accommodations on the basis of race. This basically meant that it was entirely illegal for an employer to discriminate against anyone in any aspect of employment. Another important act was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This act invalidated any use of a test or device to determine if someone was eligible to vote. Yeah, remember those literacy tests people had to take in order to vote? Well, you could pretty much take those and throw those out the window. With this act, blacks started to become more politically involved as more and more black representatives started to become elected. These acts overall helped encourage greater social equality within the United States. They also managed to slim down the gap between wealth and education. The actions that had taken place in the civil rights movement would soon shape what we know as America today. So all in all, it wasn't until the civil rights movement African Americans started to get actual rights. It would only take America over 300 years to realize what equality for all people really meant. And the civil rights movement proved to be successful because of the steady incline of equality African Americans received in the decades following the 1950s. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Crash is produced and directed by Anthony Chang. Our script supervisor is John Park. The associate producer is Marcus Fong. The show is written by Ken Wu, John Kim, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. You can ask questions about today's video, and they'll be answered by our team of historians. And as they say in my hometown, oh wait, nothing happens at Diamond Bar. Well, don't forget to be awkward.